L- Ladies and gentlemen, the INAH and the Chateau of Fontainebleau are very happy to welcome you here. Now, the next roundtable will be searching for the Great North, the invention of the Nordic landscape in the 19th century. I wish you a good conference. Thank you very much.
Et pardon pour ce petit retard, mais notre ami Knut Lio.
Sorry for this delay, but our colleague Knut Lyhrgård is really involved in a marathon race today, going from one meeting to the next. So we wanted to give him a few minutes rest. I'd like to start with a quote from Théophile Gautier, who in 1841, at the time of the Salon, said, "Mr. Biard, coming from a long trip to the North Pole, the great regions of Greenland and Spitzberg were the reflection of the aurora borealis, illuminates incredible layers of snow. In fact, has highlighted with great sincerity his paintings of these places." And this, in fact, does not give us the desire to go to the North Pole. For Théophile Gautier, the landscapes are piles of snow, which are really of mediocre interest to people from temperate zones. The more the painting is true to reality, the less it seems real. The walrus hunting, which is probably very true to life, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to show you this, but this painting of the walrus hunt is quite amazing, and it seems quite improbable, even though it is totally true to nature. François-Auguste Biard went to the North Pole, to the Spitzberg, the great northern areas, in 1839, accompanying an research expedition. And he started with this expedition, he opened up a new field of painting, a kind of genre painting he went from that to these rather fantastic landscapes, which almost seem to be fantasy. And so when he comes to the Salon of 1841, in one single painting, he brings together different viewpoints of this Spitzberg, with this beautiful view of the aurora borealis during his travels in the north. What's interesting here is that François-Auguste Biard is going to create a more than real image of these Nordic landscapes for the Paris population, even if he says they were their interest, in these landscapes was mediocre. In fact, he is in a kind of fantasy world, which was prepared by some paintings such as this one, which is a boat being attacked by polar bears, a painting that was inspired by Book of Adventures. And he also drew inspiration from illustrations done by other travelers on earlier expeditions. Here, he will have some very precise renderings of glacier landscapes. And this, in fact, is going to influence Théophile Gautier. Here you see this extraordinary painting by Edwin Henry Lancer, Man Proposes, God Disposes, which is today at the Royal Holloway. This painting is said to be haunted because they say that if you walk in front of it, you will fail your exams. There are stories of students who have committed suicide after having seen this work. So there are some rather macabre imagination feelings, etc., with regards to these works. This is something that has continued to date. Here I wanted to show you the cover page of a bestseller that was printed in 2017 called Terror by Dan Simmons, which was immediately translated. For the American, German, and Spanish versions, you always have this picture of the Magdalena Bay by Biard, which tends to bring together the anxiety of death, which is brought to mind by these pictures. And what's important to know is that when you are in the Spitzberg, you find traces of people who were caught by chance by the ice, and in fact, fishermen who were caught in the ice and whose only remains are their skeletons. So this life haunted by death, the fear of being trapped by nature, by ice, by this nature which is stronger than everything else. And this is really well projected in this painting. Here you have the impression of being thrust into a fairy tale, into a landscape that people are not really going to believe, in fact. This book, in fact, is associated to the disappearance of a ship which was lost in the ice. The story of people who lost their lives in these icy waters and these areas which haunt now. For this popular image, all you need to do is refer to a best-selling series, Game of Thrones. You know, the winter is coming phase, which is opening up to a northern landscape with a great deal of mystery. This is something which is very obsessive in modern imaginary. The success of 1841, despite what Théophile Gautier said, this has opened the way to the discussions on the North and the imagery and imagination it raises. Here we're going to talk about how this northern imaginary thought is in fact represented today. We have with us Knut Logut from the Nordic Institute of Art. Prior to this institute, he worked with a number of very important museums of Norway. He is one of the essential players for bringing together here in Fontainebleau the long list of participants from the Nordic countries. And in fact, there is an exhibition underway that can be visited, in fact, which is dealing with the Sauvages médité. And you know that there are works, in fact, which show that the Norwegian artist, far from home, invented this Nordic landscape, which is going to be built little by little. I'm also happy to present Adèle Akamatsu, who, in fact, Adèle Akamatsu is at the University of Tours. She has worked on the German painters of the 19th century, and they invented a north compared to the landscapes of Italy. You know, that it was at the time when the northern landscapes began to appear, a mix of the imaginary and the veritable experience. And I must say then you have Thierry Loger from the Centre André Chastel, who is scientific coordinator of a project on the representation of natural sciences heritage. and he will speak of the scientific expedition that Biard took part in. He's also going to present the challenge this represents for an art historian to go in the field and to confront the material that was gathered together by the artists to build this knowledge and build this representation of new landscapes, landscapes that we are then discovering with its hardship and specificities. Then Knut is going to present the emergence of this northern imaginary. Knut, thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, France, and I shall try to stick to my 10 minutes. If not, France has assured me she will kick me. But first of all, I would like to say I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to participate in this panel on the romantic image of the North with such distinguished speakers, both from here from France and also from other countries in Scandinavia. And I like to ask a question. I mean, this conference and this talk in particular deals a lot with the North. But I now like to ask the question, what is the North? And you have, of course, shown the image from, we can just stay there for a while. No, just stay there. You have shown images from, from Game of Thrones. Yes. So there we know that we don't know what the North is there either. It's something mysterious, distant skull. But which North are we talking about? I mean, do we talk about Northern Europe in general, which would include German Romanticism and Nordic Romanticism? Do we talk about Scandinavia when we say the North? Or do we talk about individual countries? I mean, in the national anthem of Sweden, you sing "Jag vill leva, jag vill dö i Norden." I will live, I will die in the North. But the North, for the Swedes, means Sweden. And for the Norwegians, it usually means Norway. So the North can also be used as a metaphor for your own country and national pride. And then, of course, we very often talk about the high North when we talk about, when we say the North, we mean the Arctic, the northern Norway, northern Sweden, northernmost parts of Scandinavia. And since I know that Carl-Johan in a while will concentrate on early depictions of Scandinavia, Dahl, etc. I will concentrate mostly in my talk on the image of the far north, the Arctic. And then we can go to the next image. This seems very cropped to me. Yes, horribly cropped. What has happened? Well, sorry about that. Something must have happened in translation. Anyway, I'm sure you can get an image of what this is. In the earliest sources about the North, that's Scandinavia, it's described as Ultima Thule, Thule at the edge of the world. For the Greeks and the Romans, it was a place in distance, a cold place, a place of danger. And this is also a view reflected in early maps like this one by Willem Barents from the very late 1500s. Yes, that looks much better. And William Barnes had led the first expedition up to the north. He was trying to find the northeast passage, but it led him up to Spitsbergen or Svalbard. So it was the first known expedition there. And this was, of course, very much about trade and about hunt, whaling, finding new sources, just like what we're doing in the Arctic today for digging for oil, drilling for oil and gas and energy. But we see how this image of the North as a place of danger is reflected. The North is surrounded by monsters. Of course, this is partly to do with the image of the North as a place of danger, but it also has a pragmatic reason, because this was about trade. So they wanted to protect their interests. No, don't go there, it's horrible, it's horrible. We'll keep it to ourselves. We can have the next. And you see also this is also a very early map, even earlier. Carta Maria, the first one of Scandinavia. And you have Iceland up there. and you have Norway and Sweden called Scandia, and you have a little island called Thule, and that is Thule, of the Greeks, Ultima Thule. And again, it's surrounded by all sorts of monsters and strange creatures. And here is the the maelstrom outside Lofoten, which we also know from Edgar Allan Poe's romantic story from the mid-19th century. Here it is mostly the nature that it makes it dangerous. By Olaus Magnus, this very important Swedish bishop who settled in Rome and published a book on the Nordic people. And we can jump to the next picture. Pontoppidan, again, the image that there was sea serpents outside the coast of Norway. And we're now into the Age of Enlightenment. But this view still sticks. And then, next. Henry Fuseli, or Johann Heinrich Fuseli, as we will say in German and Norwegian. This is based on a poem, Paradise. Yes, Paradise Lost. Thank you, Milton. As Francais, this is my second talk today, so my head is standing still. The night hag. You know, the witch, visiting Lapland witches, and we see what the witches in Lapland, whether it's in northern Scandinavia, are doing to little innocent children. So, and it's the view that the North also was a place of sorcery, of black magic, also existed for a long time. Witches were burnt. A monument to the witches were erected in the early years of the 2000s by Louis Bourgeois, I should mention, but we should go to the Romantic period because for this view of the North, this really settled, and that's why I think the Romantics were so attracted to it. They had this idea, very few had been there, of course, but they had this idea that the North was a place of mystery and danger. And several writers of the time write about it. Very early in the 19th century, the Danish writer, poet Adam Oehlenschläger described the region as situated to the far north. The climate is excessively cold, for it is only in summer that the sun appears above the horizon. And he goes on to describe this as a vast and gold landscape where nothing grows. And even Charlotte Bronte in Jane Eyre mentions the North. The bleak shores of Lapland, Siberia, Spitsbergen, Nova Zembla, Iceland, Greenland, with the vast sweep of the Arctic zones and those forlorn regions of dreary space. And let's not forget the opening of Mary Shelley's Gothic novel Frankenstein. Where does it open? You know it. In the Arctic Sea, yes, in the ice sea. Yes, exactly. It starts and ends in the ice sea. And she writes, or the teller writes, that we were nearly surrounded by ice, which closed in the ship on all sides, scarcely leaving her the sea room in which she floated. Our situation was somewhat dangerous, especially as we were compassed around by a very thick fog. And then, what does they appear? Yes, this is the place where the monster that Frankenstein created appears for the first time. So I think this association with the Gothic tradition also makes this interesting. If you go to the next picture, I said that he was the first artist. We talked about, you know, these artists like Friedrich, Caspar David Friedrich, whose image of the North we saw, and these writers, they had never been to the North. They had hardly been to Norway. One of the first artists to venture up to the northernmost parts were actually the Norwegian Peder Balke, who, as Frans mentioned, you can see an exhibition of here at Fontainebleau for the festival, together with works by Biard and also the modernist Anna Bergman, who ventured on a trip in 1832, and that became very essential to him, and he later painted several images from the north. This is an early one, quite naturalistic to be him. Let's have the next image. He was of course inspired by other artists who had been to the north, not Norwegians, but the Swede Anders Fredrik Sköldebrand, who went there around 1800 and published a series of prints in A Voyage Pittoresque au Cap du Nord. and also the German artist Christian Ezdorf, who I think you will talk about later, Carl-Johan. Yeah, but you will show an image at least. Yes. But if we go on, I think Balke is very important. Next picture. So even if some of you have heard us talk about him already, you might get bored by Balke. But here we have, he moves away from a sort of academic description of the landscape. He's very little interested in topography. He's interested in the memory of the landscape, the image that this landscape made on him in the 1830s. And here is a late, something in the and he was also a very experimental artist. He worked a lot with reduction. So in this case, he is by many regarded as a proto-modernist. You can remove the lighthouse and you will have a Rothko. But this gives you an impression. This is quite close actually to what the Romantic writers write about, the bleak shores of the north. So it's closer to that than to perhaps the real north. And we must move on since I have very little time left. Here we have the Northern Lights. This is the very late Balke. He had now stopped exhibiting in public, just working for his own pleasure as an artist. These pictures are small. They are like an iPhone or something like that. And this is made just by black and white. First the white layer, then added black very thin, which he has scraped away. He can almost use his hand, his fingernails, to get the effect of Northern Lights as he wanted it. But this is a time for discovery of the North. We have Biard, who you have mentioned, who joined the research expedition in 1839 and actually came up to Svalbard, Spitsbergen. If you're confused by the name, we all are. Spitsbergen is really the name of one island, while the entire island group is called Svalbard, but the Norwegian government insists that we should call it Svalbard. Isn't that right? So you from the embassy? Yes? Thank you. Yes. So Spitsbergen is really one island, but in the rest of the world, they use Spitsbergen also for the entire group. So next picture. You have already shown that. This is, of course, inspired by the Franklin expedition. Nobody knew what had happened, so artists could imagine it. You see the polar bears tearing away on the remains of the explorers. And then later in the century, we had more explorers, the Nansen, who went to Greenland and the North Pole, Amundsen, who went to the South Pole, Scott also went to the South Pole. And also contemporary artists are occupied with the North. I like to end my notes now. We can all talk more about this during the discussion afterwards. John Jonas, who has been inspired both by the volcano saga on Iceland, and this is under the glacier, inspired by Halldór Laxness, Under the Glacier. So a lot of her footage is from the Icelandic landscape. But it's a sort of general idea, again, of the North as this place of supernatural forces and strong natural forces, of course. So we are really back where we started with Ultima Thule. Now, we don't need to say more about that, but that is the North as it is today, of course.
Thank you very much, Knut. Merci beaucoup pour cette première partie.
Thank you very much for this first part of the roundtable, which brings us to the heart of the subject, that is to say, the representation of the North, the imagery of the North, for which artists have contributed essential parts. This is an imagery which comes from quite far, as Knut has shown with these ancient maps, an imagery which is going to be fed by popular literature in the 19th century, but which is also going to benefit the experience of these landscapes and the physical experience, which is going to be described by Carl-Johan Olsen. That is to say, he's going to speak about the immediate relationship with nature and the more distant relationship with memory, and that of the artists who have invented this national landscape.
So many here. I'm going to talk a little about the establishment of or establishing of the pictorial north, so to speak. How artists found a way to express the north in painting and drawing in the early 19th century, and I'm going to talk in particular about Johan Christian Dahl, the Norwegian artist, and often referred to as the father of Norwegian painting, or the Norwegian national painter. But the first, the next up, I'm just going to show you because of great importance, Allard van Everdingen became. He has been called the discoverer of the pictorial north. I don't know if that's true, but it's not unlikely anyway. And he traveled quite, as I understand it, quite relatively little is known about his journeys to the north, but he went to Scandinavia in 1644, visiting Sweden and Norway, painting after he had returned, paintings like this, who has become kind of emblematic Nordic images. And the next one is another example, less conventional, one might say, or at least from our point of view. And the next one, here we have Johan Christian Dahl then. He decided quite early on that he would like to become an artist, and he started as an apprentice with a decorational painter. This is what his portrayals of Norway looked like. Maybe not fair to say they're not very impressive, but they're charming in a way, but they're not as powerful and naturalistic as they would become after a while. But his ambition was very early to become the national painter of Norway. But in Norway, there was no domestic art scene whatsoever. Not an academy, as Knut mentioned before, not until the 20th century, and he had to go abroad, and he went to Copenhagen to study at the Academy of Art there. And wanting to become a national painter of Norway, Denmark is not the ideal place to study, since it's a very flat country. There is a famous quote, Dahl writing home to someone, saying that, well, I will make do with a water fountain, painting rapids and waterfalls, so to speak. But for him then, a very important starting point were the paintings by Dutch artists, Allard van Everdingen and Jacob Isaksson van Ruysdael, in Danish collections, the private collections and the royal collection. And Dahl, he started copying this. I mean, artists, he wrote in a letter home to his old teacher in Bergen, although no one becomes a master just by copying, it is nevertheless necessary. Raphael himself had to study the old. The landscape painter I tried to learn from are Ruysdael and Everdingen. There is nothing by Lorraine or Vermeer, he probably means Vernet, in Copenhagen. But first and foremost, I study nature. A pity there are no cliffs and water here, but then one has to do with the water fountain. And Dahl, I'm going to show you a few examples, hoping to show you how Dahl becomes more and more independent in relation to the old masters, becoming more of a modern romantic painter. This is a first step, you might say. The painting to the left is a painting by Ruysdael, and the painting to the right is a painting by Dahl, dating from 1817. And it's very interesting because he used exactly almost the same elements as Ruysdael. It's been called a free copy after this painting by Ruysdael, but he really changed the places to make it more dramatic, to make the water seem to stream towards the beholder. And it's a very large painting. He had been in Sweden, at the rocky coast of Sweden, on an excursion before painting this one. And it was bought by the king of Denmark, Frederick VI. And that has been interpreted as him missing Norway or mourning the loss of Norway and compensating with this painting. And it's more wild nature. In Ruysdael's painting, there is timber, so there are traces of people mastering or humans mastering nature. But in Dahl's painting, it's just wild. I'll be a little bit quicker. Dahl's ambition was to return to Norway, but for different reasons it would take a lot of time before he could do that. So he went to Dresden. His intention was to stay there not very long, but he remained for the rest of his life. And in Dresden he complained that I find so few pieces of nature that have not been touched by human beings, and this is one example. This is a very dramatic landscape, but it's entirely cultivated and looks very tidy. And he was, even when he painted it, he said it looks too tidy. I have to use a varnish to make it more suggestive. And the next one is interesting because here something happens. He paints a Nordic landscape, but he uses the same rock formation, and this is, I think, this is beautiful in relation to romantic philosophy, dealing with the far and with longing and with imagination. This is an act of longing and imagination. Him dreaming himself back to Norway, and. Of course, in Dresden, he had met Friedrich, who had made impression on him, and this. The next one is just as a reference, and that's also the previous one is I think a very good example of how he becomes independent in relation to Ruysdael, because this is a composition that is not at all following a formula. This is a very unconventional, quite unpleasing, not very inviting composition. The Ruysdael composition was a way for him to paint nature, but without having to think about different difficult things as composition, etc. And perhaps the one after the next one. This just as a last one from the end of Dahl's career, showing that he refined his way of portraying Norwegian nature and becoming as confident like this. He could use only a sole tree to portray a whole nation in a very striking and convincing way. This is a birch tree in a storm. And I think the next one is just an example. It's Ezdorf, and very little is known about Ezdorf, so I dare not say very much about him. But like Knut mentioned, he traveled to the north in the 1820s from Germany, and he remained here for a very long time. And he too was very dependent of the old Dutch masters, as we can see here. This could almost be a Ruysdael, a forest scene. But when he traveled, something happened. He traveled to Iceland, for example. This is an entirely different kind of composition. You, of course, have a lot of Friedrich in it, but it's also very naturalistic, but in the romantically perceived sense of the word naturalistic. So that's Ezdorf, and I would just like to close by showing how important the Dutch masters of the Danish collections were. This is Martinus Rørby when he traveled to Norway. He had in mind this painting by Everdingen probably, and he recognized a similar landscape. That one is in the National Gallery of Denmark and was accessible to Rørby. So that was just a little about or thoughts on how a way of portraying the North was established.
Thank you very much, Carl-Johan. Merci beaucoup. Je pense que c'est
Thank you very much. I think it is very important to understand how the painters took hold of these landscapes during the 19th century. Therefore, to look at their masters, their models, who were these Dutch painters from the 17th century. And so therefore, for a while, some of these landscapes weren't very different from each other. If we compare certain landscapes, some rocky configurations, certain stereotypes, waterfalls that we had in showing the Alps, showing the differences between a fjord and a lake in the Alps. You always have rocks, waterfalls, and we don't see really what is so specific about the North, which is supposed to be represented here. But little by little, there's a specific terminology, vocabulary, a certain interest in the lighting. And Balke is the most radical example here in this approach. And that is something that is taking place with these painters. And now we're going to look at the Germans. There was a similar process that appeared in the German painters. When we started preparing for this round table, we didn't know that we could have translation in both the directions. And in order to dialogue with our Swedish and Norwegian colleagues, we had also invited our French speakers to speak in English. So they will speak in English, and they will speak in English because they've prepared their presentation in English, and you will have a simultaneous translation. And she's thanking the interpreters for their work. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy
to speak about my research for my PhD project. So I will talk about the German artists a few generations later than Caspar David Friedrich, who decided he could paint the North in Dresden, and that Germany was already the North. But later on, German artists decided to discover the Scandinavian North. And Everdingen's and Dahl's travels and paintings gave a decisive impulse to this development of German artistic travels to Sweden and most of all to Norway. This is imbued with these two examples, Everdingen's Dahl, that, for instance, Christian Ernst Bernhard Morgenstern, as early as 1827, and Louis Gurlitt in 1832 decided to travel to Norway and later on to Sweden. This painting of a waterfall west of Oslo, it appears as a variation on the popular theme of powerful waters shut in by rocks, which we have already seen in paintings by Everdingen, Riisdahl, and Dahl. But Louis Gurlitt also managed to free himself from such models. For instance, in this painting that he made just after his 1835 trip to Norway, he chose to paint the fjord as the background for an idyllic and harmonious landscape with a peasant life it is home to, the harvest. The interest in the depiction of an idealized peasant life is also important, and it offers a counterpoint to this image of dangerous or wild north, which was developed by Everdingen and later by Dahl. If this painting establishes a parallel with the Alpine picturesque, it has also a great freshness, most of all in the description of the light, which is that of a specific time during the course of the day. It is marked, for instance, by the line between the light and the shadow and the low angle beams you can see on the grass near the road. One can feel that Gurlitt has studied this landscape on the spot. And indeed, during these years, Norway was discovered as a new place for open-air painting and drawing, not only for German landscape painters, but also for Danish and Norwegian and Swedish artists. Here is an example of a drawing by Morgenstern in August 1827. We can imagine the artist on the spot and rather puzzled by this chaos of rocks which surround tiny and isolated log cabins, and the rocks and whirling waters were very popular motifs. The artist also painted oil studies. La prochaine et celle d'encore après. Thank you. Such as this Labrophos near Kongsberg by Georg Zal, who was a painter who studied and was established in Düsseldorf. So Modum, Faigum, the Labrophos, these are some of the names which often appear in trip accounts and work titles, because in their quest for beauty spots and motif to study, the artist often ended up in the same places. Ezdorf was one of the few painters to venture to the high north, and with the indented coastlines of Sweden and Norway and the waterfalls, the fjord region around the Hardanger Fjord and the Sogne Fjord emerged as a laboratory for the invention of a new landscape. Andreas Achenbach from Düsseldorf is maybe the best known of these German painters who decided to travel north rather than south, because Italy was still the traditional destination to become an accomplished artist. And after a first trip to Sweden in 1835, he traveled to Norway in 1839. With a friend of his, he joined the Norwegian painter Thomas Fearnley. Thomas Fearnley had been a student of Johann Christian Dahl, and was in the mid-1820s in the fjord region. And together they traveled to the banks of the Hardanger Fjord and the Sogne Fjord. And this painting was made just after Achenbach returned to Düsseldorf. He combines elements he has seen with narrative elements in order to trigger the public imagination. So he hasn't forgotten anything. So we can see the waterfall, the steep mountain side plunging into water, the log cabins, and most of all this conspicuous standing stone at the foreground. Achenbach had seen such stones on the north banks of the Sogne Fjord, but this is also a motif that he borrowed from German Romantic painting. So Düsseldorf and its academy from the beginning of the 1840s attracted young Norwegian painters such as Hans Fredrik Gude, and this renewed the vogue for Scandinavian trips, because international friendships between German and Scandinavian artists played an essential role. Thank you. So Georg Zal is one of these painters from Düsseldorf who traveled 3 times to Norway in 1847, 1850 and 1854, each time to collect studies made on the spot that he would reuse in composition. And with Hans Friedrich Gude, he's one of the few painters to adopt this point of view from above. He creates a panoramic view on the fjord and its mountainous surroundings, playing on the sensation of vastness and remoteness in a painting which is at the same time spectacular and very descriptive. So at the opposite of what Balke decided to paint. Zal explained that he tried to catch the luminosity of the midnight sun, but I'm not sure that you can see the midnight sun on the fjords. Anyway, this was such an ambition was perceived and praised as a new tendency to depict unusual landscapes and rare natural phenomena with a new accuracy. The French painter François-Auguste Biard took even further the confrontation with an extreme landscape. In the summer of 1839, as Andreas Achenbach was on his way to the fjords, Biard and his fiancée Léonie Donnet were on their way to a far more uncommon and risky destination, the Arctic island of the Spitzbergen. And in Hammerfest, they joined the scientific expedition of the Commission Scientifique du Nord on board of the ship La Recherche. And we've already spoken about it, so it's time that I...
Merci beaucoup, Adèle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adèle. What is very interesting in this way of catching the stories is that it is not only a question of nature, but it's also a question of art. So there's this heritage of paintings that is haunting the collective memories of artists. All these paintings that have marked the codes, the paintings of Everding and Rosedale. And there's also this question of relations. You talked about Düsseldorf, which was also a melting pot of relations, because Knut and myself, that's where we met a few years ago in the Düsseldorf school with its international influence. And the Scandinavian artists began traveling. They started training elsewhere, not just in Copenhagen, places like Düsseldorf, and there was a strong, friendly relations between these artists. And German artists will therefore travel to Norway, more particularly, to work on the spot. And this is what Adèle just presented. So this is very important. There's a change in paradigm. This creation of an art school in Scandinavian countries and this deep connection with German artists, but not only German artists, with the British and the French ones too. And what is also very interesting, and maybe that'll be one of your questions, and Thierry Loger will talk about this also in his presentation, is this question regarding this light, this strange northern light. When you'll see Balke's paintings in the exhibition here in the Mérimée apartments, you will say, wow, what beautiful nighttime paintings, and one of them is really magical. We were talking about this earlier on. Actually, it's the sun, and here you see a light, which is really strange. It is neither the nighttime nor daylight, and that is exactly what Biard notes in his letters or in his journal when he describes his travelings. It's this pale night light which totally transforms the landscape. And this writing where he becomes a mythical hero, and instead of being a Dutch hero, he talks about these landscapes which are which he crosses by crossing the Netherlands. So this calm nature. And all of a sudden, he talks about a wild ride through Callow's engravings with Saint Anthony's temptation. So mythical legends between the arid mountains between Sweden and Norway. And then he doesn't talk about images anymore. He talks about poetry when Biard says that he is riding his horse like in Lenore's ballad. Everything seems spectacular, haunting, the birch trees that look like skeletons, and the sound of owls mocking the travelers riding towards his death. So there's a change in the landscape, a sudden change, and you find a sort of comfort towards a more hostile nature. And Biard does this trip, but his conditions are much more comfortable than what he narrates. And he does it together with a scientific expedition, and that'll serve him. And he will also provide some representations. And thank you, Thierry, for talking to us about this.
For this invitation, I'm really honored to share this roundtable with all these specialists. The reason why I'm here today is to present you some of the research we did in 2015 and 2016 with Olivier Véron and Marie-Claude Chaudonneret and the expedition La Recherche in the far north in 1839. It was a part of a larger multidisciplinary research program called Patrinat, for which I was the scientific coordinator. The purpose of this program was to bring together researchers from all specialties, natural sciences and human sciences combined, around the same desire to contribute to the heritage of objects belonging to the history of natural history. Patrinat's main work therefore focused on a large decoration painted between 1851 and 1862 by François-Auguste Biard to decorate the entrance hall of the mineralogy gallery of the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle. We had been alerted by François Farge, the museum's mineralogy professor, to the fact that this great setting was in danger. The museographer in charge of the redesign of the mineralogy gallery had planned to mask it by fixing neutral panels on the decoration. The reason was simple. You can sketch. Scenes of walrus, reindeer, or bear hunting are depicted, and the contemporary public would have complained considering that those motifs were indecent. There is, of course, a gap between these 19th century scenes and the museum's current ecological policy. We have therefore thought about ways to enhance this setting, make it intelligible, and thus protect it. Our goal was therefore to carry out contextualization work in order to restore this painted panorama to its original interest. This decoration was created by Biard 12 years after a 9-month exploration trip that the artist made in the far north. At the request of the state, the painter composed a complete panorama of more than 200 square meters, observable at 350 degrees, of one of the most northern sites explored by the mission of 1839. The scene represents a geological view of the Svalbard in the Bay of the Madeleine of Spitsberg. Therefore, to be able to study this view at 360 degrees, and especially for the purpose of enhancement, thanks to the technological and financial support of the Plémo 3D platform, we have recreated the entire set with flat views without distortion. Indeed, and this was the main reason why it was not so much known, there is no global view of this painting because no optical measuring instruments had so far been able to reproduce it without major distortions. Each wall of the room contained 3 canvases. Those above the door, you have them, represent the geological panorama, and those on the sides of the bay depict historical scenes. 4 represent huntings, 2 are picturesque anecdotes of the journey, and the 2 last ones show scientific collecting. So the painting indeed is an artistic object, of course, produced for an audience in search of spectacular, but it's also a witness to the history of scientific activity. Thus, the danger would have been to treat it only as an art historian without dealing with the links with science. For this reason, we have worked with zoologists and mineralogists. Together, we looked for pieces of botany, zoology, anthropology related to the 1839 trip in natural sciences collections to show that this decoration was linked to the collections. So our role as art historian was to reveal that the stakes of Biard's participation was in this journey. To do this, it was also necessary to evaluate the part of invention or fantasy inherent in the expedition and the resulting iconography. I wanted to talk about this painting, but finally Franz did it in the introduction, so I won't go further about, no, it's okay. But just this painting was made before he went to the far north, but what it's really interesting for me to understand there is that Biard himself wrote that Louis-Philippe told him when he showed this painting at the salon, you guessed the far north. And the king would have offered him to join the expedition that left 3 months later for Spitzberg. The reality is completely different. Biard asked to participate to this expedition, and he was allowed to go with the ship, but he was obliged to pay for his own trip. So it's not really the same story. So to understand how the story and the image was changed, we have to analyze all combined. So the essential work concerning the expedition of the research is its immense reports, which comprise 20 volumes and 516 plates. Each illustrator has his own specialty. Meyer is the main illustrator. His role is to capture the places that present a remarkable aspect. Giraud, next one. Giraud's speciality is the living. He has made some natural history drawings and a multitude of portraits of the inhabitants. And then Bevalet has made drawings of plants, animals, and made also about 10 plates on the Northern Lights. But in these atlases, the scientific atlases, the name of Biard is totally absent. His work appears in only one plate. This plate is the view of Bear Island. And we know that Biard wanted to dock at Bear Island to make a quick sketch, but he wanted to stop just because he wanted to make a sketch of bears, and he only saw birds. So this plate is not an illustration of the journey. It is a reworking of the painting exhibited in 1841, in which he glorifies Guémard, the expedition's director, by placing him in an observed setting. Thus, Biard does not illustrate. He uses scene elements to create striking compositions. This is reflected in the works he presented at the 1841 Salon, where he shows how much his priority was the exoticism of eyes. However spectacular they may be, they raise to the question of the scientificity of the eye. This problem is the same as the one we find with Orientalism in 19th century. Indeed, to resume an easy opposition, we often confront Ingres and Delacroix by affiliating one to a fantasized Orientalism and the other to a lived Orientalism. We know today that Delacroix's work is also a pictorial fantasy. However, he is considered as a traveling painter, whereas he has took part to a single journey in a lifetime. Biard, more than a traveling painter, I would say is a traveler who paints. Before building his image as a painter, he built his image as an adventurer who lived thrilling adventures, and it is this image of him that has conditioned the success of these exotic paintings. So when we talk about the traveling artist, we must also take into consideration the immobility of art historians to evoke an artist's journey. Often when we talk about trips to the east, for example, specialists only know, most of the time, the works, the correspondence, and the archives, but do not know the places of the trip. How then to judge the part of fantasy of the image when the researcher is sometimes the real relay of this fantasy? Concerning the expedition we are talking about today, I can say really easily that at the beginning of my research, I had a well-fantasized image of this mythical far north. And aware of this danger, we decided to support our research in France with work on the expedition site. Of course, we were not going to find the Lapland of 1839, nor use the modes of transport of the time. But we took the same itinerary that Biard took. We searched for the places or regions that were represented by the illustrators. And we had with us reproductions of plates, the travel reports, which we constantly reread as we progressed on the spot. It was by rereading them in front of sight that we were able to judge the relevance of the impressions of the trip. To cite one example, there are multiple passages specifying how birches in Lapland cannot grow and constitute stunted forests that have fascinated botanists. We had found many traces of them in the museum's botanical collections, but that does not replace at all the impression left by these birches in the panorama in Lapland. This journey allowed us also to understand a large quantity of the image produced, and in particular those concerning the customs of the Lapps. Of course, not by observing contemporary Sami and considering them as living archives, but by documenting the art and traditions, especially at the Museum of Alta, a project that we couldn't have made in France. So Biard is supposed to have painted 55 studies of Lapps. We found 7 of them, and we find them also, next picture please, in Louis-Philippe under the Lapp stand and Lestadius teaching the Lapps. Note the diversity of the hats presented. It should be noted that these headdresses are socially codified. They differ according to regions, ages, marital status. Biard observed them and correctly attributed them. Then, the cradle is also precisely studied. It's made of a hollowed-out trunk, and above the child's head, there are 3 straps from which pearls and silver buttons hang. They are used to repel the huldas. The huldas are said to live underground. They steal children and replace them with old huldas. It's before. The exchange child looks the same, but does not grow and becomes ugly. So the presence of these silver buttons in the painting lets us understand that Biard maybe had one of the cradle, but also understood the function of it. This knowledge of the customs of the Lapps come above all from Lestadius, then, pastor of Carresuando. He told the members of the expedition about Lapland mythology. The work dedicated to him represents the evangelization of the Lapps. As explained to us in Tromsø, the snow strata presented do not correspond in any way to the ancient housing of the Lapps. The painter built them burrows leading to their tents. This is not an ethnographic truth, it's a spectacular addition once again. And the representation is also a geological false. These snow strata are taken from those found at the foot of the glacier, the mark of those left by the stream. Another element was revealed to us at the Tromsø Museum, and I once again want to thank the team for that. Next image, please. Her hidden character intrigues visitors. He is this strange character lit by fire. We had no answer about who it is until we search into the Sami mythology. In their religion, there are gods living with the lapse and even in their tents. So is Saraka. Saraka is one who allows the soul to become a fetus. She is the midwife who helps the human being to enter the world. She resides in the Aran, and the Aran is the fireplace of the hut. And for this reason, she is called the mother of fire. This goddess of fire living in the tent could be this figure, and she would embody the opposition of true religions. On the one hand, the Bible with Lestadius, and on the other, the ancient beliefs, which would also correspond to the statements of Lestadius, explaining in the reports that the true religions often coexisted among the lapse. So thus, we can affirm that Biard is a scientific artist for sure, and not an artist at the service of science. He has the ability to create a scientific show and a wonderful staging of the idea of discovery. That is clearly the reason why he has been chosen for the setting of the Mineralogy Gallery. We could not have proposed these words about the works by Biard if we had not met local specialists, work at the Tromsø Museum, the Alta Museum, or simply by exploring the sublime landscapes of Lapland, which once again leads me to affirm how much being an art historian dealing with traveling artists must also be the business of traveling art historians. Thank you.
First, thank you to all the speakers. Merci beaucoup. Nous avons...
Thank you very much. We have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions in the audience. If you have any questions for the speakers, don't hesitate. Let me maybe start by thanking you once again, because I think that there's a real resonance between the various contributions. We have gone from a mythical north to an explored north, a north which was nourished by art, by the landscape traditions, and which in the 19th century was transformed in depth thanks to this reinvention. And this in light of the myth and the scientific expression. There's a coming together at the level of Biard in a spectacularly efficient way. But we've also spoken of Balke, and in Balke, you have that experimentation with form and matter, which is also linked to this landscape experience and to the limits of what this genre art could encounter in terms of the market for art. Biedenbach has painted his works in a workshop, and he's more working towards exhibitions and experimentation in terms of the representation of the phenomena like the Northern Lights, for example. And we have, in fact, these layers of ink and pigment, and how the material is scraped away. You see this experimentation. So you see, in fact, two different approaches. One which is a north which is extremely efficient, and one which becomes a source of inspiration for aesthetic needs, and both will be important. I think that the exhibition illustrates these two aspects very well. Does anyone want to add anything or ask questions?
Well, I think your last point is very interesting. There are definitely at least two traditions, if not more, in how the North is depicted at this period. And you have in the exhibition demonstrated, you have Balke's paintings, who are, therefore the image of the north, very little to do with topographical observation. Biard's and point of view is the opposite, as you have demonstrated. There are also elements of imagination. He is still there for a scientific truth. Then you have, I suppose, many aspects in between these two schools. But I think there are many aspects in how the discovery of the North in the art world happens. I like to just add, I mean, we have talked about different Norths, as we said at the start. I mean, one thing is the general view of Scandinavia, the other thing is the far north. And we have heard about both the German artists who travel there, but I think also your point, Frans, that there were Norwegian artists were also traveling at this time, or Scandinavian artists, to get an education. So there was, I think it's important to stress that this wasn't a sort of German artist, Swedish artist. No, this was interaction. You mentioned some of the Norwegian artists who accompanied their German colleagues, and we could have added that Christian Morgenstern traveled in the company of Knut Bode. And also, I think, since we are French, there are French speakers and one Swede, one Norwegian, but no Danish here. We shouldn't forget the Danish artists in this, who are actually quite important in the 18th century in the discovery of the Scandinavian and in particular Norwegian landscape, with Erik Paulsen and Christian Lorentzen. And in particular, Paulsen is an artist. He travels there for a topographic purpose, but he turns it into something sublime. So you have that tradition there already in the 18th century, and in the very early 19th century, you have another Danish artist who settles in Norway, Johannes Flinto, who is little known outside Norway, who traveled the mountains, and actually he was the one who told Dahl where he should go. So when we give Dahl credit of discovering Norway, that's a truth with it, which is not quite true.
I was just thinking, very interesting, Thierry. I often have thought about what's the real difference then between a landscape by Everdingen or Roysdahl and Dahl, because the Dutch landscape paintings are really naturalistic, but I think that the difference is in the scientific approach, because Dahl, he was kind of an amateur scientist, a botanist, and much more interested in geology. And if you look closely at his painting, that is very similar to one by Roysdahl, or even a copy almost. You have every little correctly observed detail with science and was so important during the romantic era, and science and feelings, emotions does not exclude one another. That's it's a beautiful thing.
Yes, I just had a question for Knut, because I'm really intrigued in this idea of the experimentation you talked about. Do you think there's a link between the small time of light in the far north and the idea that Balke used so less color, and using so much black and white, and using so much type of experimentation to give a way of seeing, in a new way of seeing the landscape? Maybe.
I believe that is a very interesting observation. I mean, Balke's works, paintings, certainly has to do with light, the effects of lights on landscape, but not from a naturalist or scientist point of view, but it's the impression, the mood he wants to recreate, the landscape of memory. So yes, I think his journey to the North made a very great impression on him. He writes about it. And I think a lot about his work from his commission from Louis Philippe in the 1840s and onwards to these very late experimental works. They are about finding the right way of expressing the nature he observed there. So yes, that's definitely a point.
and about les expérimentations.
As far as the experimentation is concerned, what we can see in the exhibit, which can intrigue, not just the work Black and White by Balke, but also the work on the color of blue. How do you explain the use of new materials? Is he experimenting not just with traditional pigments and colors, but maybe with new types of dyes or colors? I really encourage you to go see the exhibit because you will see some beautiful works showing that experimentation. So what is the relationship with the actual materiality here? Are there things which invite one? He painted these very small works on support media coming from the construction sector rather than traditional canvas. So as far as the colors, the pigment used, is there anything to say about that from the point of view of experimentation?
Well, as we have already stated, Balke was an artist who experimented all the time during his career as an artist. He was, I believe, a very seeking person, a person who always searched out new ideas and wanted to try them out. He traveled a lot, as we have already established. He must have seen a lot. He must have used a lot of the influences of what he saw in his works. And in this too, I think he is very unlike most of the 19th century and more like a contemporary artist, that you allow yourself to switch medium according to what you want to, which idea you want to express. While, look at Dahl, look at Biard, when they settled their form, they would stick to it. While Balke, he's always on the move. And to answer your question more concretely, yes, he experimented with pigments. This is the time when one started to make artificial blue, the Prussian blue, which is probably what he used mostly. But this is all, Norway in the 19th century also had the largest cobalt industry in the world, and exported to China and to Europe, and due to cobalt works, mines. And we know that Balke wrote to the factory and ordered cobalt color, based on natural minerals. There we have a link to the scientific world. But we haven't had enough conservation analysis. We are working on that, actually. We're working closely with our leading conservation studio in Oslo, with a leading expert on this. So our plan is to have more analysis taken. We haven't confirmed that he actually used the cobalt. We know that he ordered it, so he must have used it.
Merci. Ce qui était très intéressant aussi dans les interventions.
Thank you. What was really interesting in the interventions here was that we saw there were ideas and beliefs with regards to nature, which were translated into the landscape painting in the north, especially, for example, the power of nature. And there was the sentence that was applied to a work called "Man Proposes, God Disposes," and opposing man and nature, in other words, God. This is something that appears often in the critiques, the representations of nature unleashed in the Great North, in the face of which man is powerless, can do nothing. So maybe there was a greater possibility of envisaging salvation at the time. And this, in fact, reduces man's capacity to master the environment. So we see here a picturesque, mythical, scientific nature which is playing a new role. And I thought it was interesting to see that Adèle Akamatsu was speaking of a nature which is almost comforting. This is the exploration of a landscape which explores the other facet of a powerful nature, and this in counterpart to the nature as presented by others. So, what do you think about the way, in fact, the various artists played with this aspect?
Composition of ideas or models for composition which were developed or established in the Alps, for instance, in Switzerland, and which were the main destination for the artists. And it was the Norwegian landscapes with their mountains and their valleys were assimilated or associated also with these more familiar landscapes, and these picturesque. Although there is a contradiction, because these German artists wanted to travel to Norway in order to escape from the Alps, which had become a touristic destination where there were too many travelers and too many painters. But once in Norway, they tend to use compositions already known, and as in the Alps, they when you read some travel accounts, you discover that they meet each other on the banks of the Sogne Fjord and in the Hardanger Fjord, and some of the very important meetings between the artists, for instance, between the Norwegian artist Adolf Tiedemann and the German artist Hermann Kaufmann, who was from Hamburg. They traveled together, and they met in Norway Gude, Hans Fredrik Gude, who was traveling with another German artist. So these artists went to Norway to discover new and untouched landscape, but they tend to attract them also to more familiar forms.
Merci.
I mean, I suppose Frans do you want us to wrap up soon? But there is one aspect we haven't touched when you talk about the Sognefjord, and that is, of course, the landscape as a place of history, because the Sognefjord was a place that was well known as a historical place with ancient monuments from the Viking Age and even older, and which was also popularized in romantic literature. Isaiah Senier's Fritjof Saga is the most famous, taking place in those parts of Norway. But that will be, that's a new chapter of it.
Mais c'est effectivement un aspect extrêmement important que.
Yes, indeed. There's something very important here in that this nature is testifying to a certain history. It is inhabited by accounts which might be specifically located, that people carry with them in their mind. You also have legends which are more closely linked to the history of Norway. This is a very strong aspect here, but it's not unique to the Scandinavian countries. When you read Pierre-Henri Valenciennes, who writes his treatise on landscape painting, he speaks of these Italian plains where you walk in the steps of the great men of the past, and where nature becomes a place of history. And this is something which is also the case for the North, but with a history that people reappropriate to carry further. And I think this is a theme which perhaps exceeds the 5 minutes that are left here. But I think that in the conferences and roundtable sessions that will take place in these 3 days, we will have the luck of having a great Nordic specialist who will talk about this and who will talk about the most recent archaeological and Viking discoveries, as well as the whole issue of Scandinavian identity. So I invite you to continue this reflection in the coming days. I wish you a successful festival. Thank you.